40 years ago, when I was just starting my career and I was a bit fed up with the ivory tower kind of academia at the University of California, I really was looking for a way to get into development work. I was in Oman and somebody said, I was trying to think of how to help the government extend services to the nomads at the edge of Oman, Saudi Arabia, in the empty quarter. And somebody said, well, go to New York and talk with Margaret Anstey. And actually it was the resident representative of the UNDP. And I thought, oh, can I do that? Anyway, I did. I flew to New York, asked for a meeting with her. She saw me. I told her what I wanted to do. And she said, I'll fix it. And she did. And that was my first experience with the UNDP. She was already by then, I think it was the Undersecretary or Deputy Secretary General of ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council at UN. She's marvelous. I think she's the preeminent UN international civil servant and a great feminist. So I just wanted to say my thanks and how honored I am to be here in this same college where she took her undergraduate degree. Also, I'd like to thank Nara specifically, who reached out to me and invited me to come, and I'm really delighted to be here. I've been talking on this subject for a couple of years, and I think I'm getting ready to now publish, but each time I talk on this, I develop it a bit further, I respond to the kind of questions, critiques that I get, so I'm hoping we'll have a good time for questions. I want to kind of justify why I think looking to our past really helps us unpack the challenges and the possibilities of migration governance. And I've just referred to Shakespeare's one line in The Tempest, whereof what's past is prologue. I remember hearing that and thinking, yeah, the past can inform our present and set out our future. And in that vein, I want to revisit our past efforts to manage migration and see where that takes us. I use the word our, although I had a few arguments in that sense with some of my colleagues in Gaziantep, because I was using the term our to include the Ottoman Empire as part of the West. And some people, I think, wanted to have a more unique sense of the Ottoman Empire. I'll just go over very quickly a few definitions, which I don't think are really necessary with this audience. I'll run through those slides very quickly. And then I want to look at the way we think we've started with our modern forced migration regime in the 20th and 21st century by first looking at the Nansen Doctrine and then how we've emerged through the 51 Convention and other kind of migration management approaches. And then I'll want to turn back to look at the late Ottoman period and how that's really, I think, informed in some ways where we are today. There are some precedents, but then there are also a lot of ruptures. So what I'm looking for is to explore whether the contemporary migration or humanitarian response to forced migration, is it possibly an outgrowth of the imperial and colonial past, or largely an abrupt disjuncture from that past? And then the question that I'm asking is, can we learn from those past experiences how to better manage mass migration, reception, integration, and general governance? As a sort of a prelude, what I do want to say is that the sort of pre-modern era of the 19th century and the early 20th century, borders and frontiers were very fuzzy. Movement was rarely restricted in these kind of imperial encounters. And multiculturalism and ethnic diversity was prominent, whether it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire or other empire, but certainly in the case of the Ottoman Empire, this was really very important and is something I want to explore. Obviously, at the same time, there was a counter-movement taking place of the kind of hegemonic and homogeneous nation-state building that was also at work during the same historical period, which resulted in the conflict and forced migrations, the ethnic cleansings. Some groups talk about the ethnic genocide and the homogenizing of subjects of the new nation-states. So, of all these colonial and imperial encounters, I think that the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century was uniquely challenged to consider and implement systems of refuge, of resettlement, and re-territorialization of sorts in order to address, organize, and manage the mass influx of peoples from its borderlands into the heartland and into its southern provinces. And I think what's important to keep in mind is that empire was the one state that I think we can certainly in modern terms say did not essentialize the tying of culture or ethnicity to territory. And I think that's important to keep in mind. So let me go through now and try to disentangle or expose some of the sort of post-colonial state attitudes to migration governance, as well as perhaps future potential. So, as I said before, I don't think I have to spend an awful lot of time with definitions. Obviously, we all create descriptive frames and categories and typologies. It's just a way we organize ourselves and our surroundings. So we have our forced migrants, and it's often very difficult to distinguish between who's a forced migrant, who's a voluntary migrant, who's a refugee, what kind of definition we're using in terms of refugees. In terms of anthropology, this brings to mind the very important anthropological notions of the self and the other, of which a great deal of expansion in our conceptual understandings of insiders, outsiders, ethnicities, minorities, the whole notion of homo sacer through Agamben's important work. But I think that one of the things I do want to keep in mind is that the UN system has two definitions of refugees. We have the UNHCR definition of a refugee, as you all know, a person who, owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside of the country of his nationality, and furthermore is unwilling or unable to avail himself of the protection of that country. So in that same notion, the idea of somebody not having the protection of a country becomes the homo sacer, the person living bare life, and that for some conceptual theorists believe that's what defines the nation state. Certainly it's a category that makes most governance systems very uncomfortable. And of course there is the UNRWA definition for Palestinians, another large group of people who have lost their country. And that is simply an operational definition, meaning a refugee from Palestine is any person whose normal place of residence was Palestine during the period 1st of June 1946 to 15th May 1948, and who lost both home and means of livelihood as a result. So you might ask yourself, well, what about those who were not resident? Where do they stand? And of course, they, for a long time, were stateless. So refugee, what I'm getting at is really, it's not a label for a special generalizable kind or type of person, but it's a descriptive rubric that includes within it a world of socioeconomic statuses, personal histories, and of course, psychological situations. So let me just do this quick historical review. The modern history of refugee management, if I can put it that way, for many people begins at the end of World War I and goes through a whole set of stages. The first being the establishment of that regime as the three big empires, the Ottoman, the Russian, and the Austro-Hungarian, collapsed, and the League of Nations was created. And then the second stage, post-World War II, when Europe had more than 40 million displaced people. Various UN agencies were set up prior to UNHCR, the UNRRA, the Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, and many others, all of them working through returning those who wanted to return, but there were still 7 million who didn't want to return and ended up being resettled elsewhere. Then we get to the colonial period between the 1960s and 1980s, also as the US is pulling out of Vietnam. The fourth phase, the end of the Cold War, the 1990s, and then our current phase, very much a fortress mentality, blurring the divide between those fleeing political persecution and those fleeing poverty. So let me just go into that a little bit in more detail, because I think there are things that we can learn. The first phase, which is often called the Nansen era, Fridtjof Nansen, a Norwegian explorer, scientist, diplomat, served as the first High Commissioner for Refugees between 1920 and 1930, and he helped thousands of refugees return home. But he also recognized that there was a very big problem with lots of stateless people moving about Europe, particularly after Lenin denationalized hundreds of thousands of Russians who were in Europe. And he saw that the biggest problem that Europe had was finding ways of moving these stateless people around Europe to where they could look for work in order to support themselves, to become self-sufficient. So he proposed, and it became very famous, the Nansen passport, and over those 20 years, over 500,000 Nansen passports were issued, first for Russians, sometimes called white Russians, and then later for Armenians, but also for a large Assyrian population that had escaped the genocide in Iraq in the 1930s. He won a Nobel Peace Prize for his work in 1938, and then we had, of course, World War II. At the end of World War II, again, we had a period of time when the world, after the creation of the UN and the UN Charter, felt that they really had to do more in order to make sure we never saw the same kind of extraordinary savagery to other human beings. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, was asked to chair a committee to create a treaty, it was going to be called an International Bill of Human Rights, a very prestigious group of politicians and thinkers met, and over 2 years eventually drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They argued for some time as to whether it should be a treaty or not, and Eleanor Roosevelt thought, let's not make it a treaty, let's make it a principle, because a principle would be stronger, and people in every country would then follow that principle. The two principles, of course, there are many different articles related to that, but the ones that I just want to point out here, because it's something we need to reflect on in terms of the modern governance, is Article 13. Everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state, and everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. Article 14, which is perhaps more important, particularly in the way that some elements of this have been criminalized, everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. This is a right that actual seeking of has been criminalized increasingly over time. So this particular declaration was then followed 2 years later by the setting up of the UNHCR in 1949. And at that time, the main purpose of the UNHCR was third country resettlement. And there are many reasons for that at the time. It's one of the reasons why the Palestinians ended up with a very different engagement, because third country resettlement was not what they were interested in. But in 1951 then, you had both agencies and the 1951 convention established. But 1951, I think, is the time when the refugee became separated from the economic migrant. So during the Nansen era, the refugee was given a document so that he or she could move to find work, to become an economic migrant, if you want to put it that way. So by granting this particular protection, political status, there was a separation of the need to become self-sufficient, the need to find work. The interesting agency that was also set up at this time, and we don't talk about it because it was never really a UN agency, originally was called the Provisional Intergovernmental Committee for the Movement of Migrants from Europe. And it's the precursor to the IOM, and its task, once the UNHCR had identified what people needed to be moved, it then basically managed the resettlement of 11 million people who had been uprooted by the war, arranged their transport in the 1950s, largely to Latin America, but also to other countries. And one of the basic reasons for this drive to get people out of the displaced camps was the fear that if you let people stew or sit in these refugee displaced camps for too long, they might become radicalized, they might become dangerous. So the philosophy in the 1950s was move them out as quickly as possible, disperse them as possible. UNHCR identified them, and then the precursor to the IOM moved them. If we move to the 1960s, I should say that UNHCR, like as with UNRWA, was meant to be a temporary agency. It was only meant to last for 3 years, and by the early 1950s, I think people who worked with UNHCR were beginning to worry of whether their mandate was going to be renewed or not. And in some ways, UNHCR was very lucky, because along came 1956, the Hungarian uprising, and suddenly UNHCR was very useful, and it proved itself to be able to move and grant asylum, or to get countries to grant asylum to large numbers of people. As we moved into the 1960s, we come to the era of decolonialization. It's also the period of the Cold War. The Cold War really re-emphasizes this distinction between a political migrant and an economic migrant. This is an image actually of Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin. So anybody who crossed over from the Iron Curtain was then welcomed into Western Europe as a heroic escapee from communism. So the refugee was a heroic figure in the 1960s, even into the 1970s. But with the end of the colonial era and the US pulling out of Vietnam, there suddenly began to be a large number of non-European refugees, and so therefore UNHCR implemented its 67 protocol, expanding the mandate of UNHCR beyond Europe and beyond pre-1951 to a broad temporal and also global perspective. Still, IOM, or its precursor, then its name begins to change several different times. It's very, very active in moving refugees, particularly those who are highly skilled to developing countries, again, very largely to Latin America. With the end of the Cold War, as you know, we start getting into the new wars, which Mark Duffield has written very well about. I think also Calder has as well. Sometimes they call them the many-hued wars, lots of small wars, but also the emergence of proxy wars, which we're still seeing today. This was a sort of a new kind of conflict, people not necessarily fleeing a political system, but rather searching for safety, for family reunification, and also security. This is just an image from Sarajevo with a Bosnian Special Forces soldier returning fire as he's trying to protect civilians coming under attack by Serbian snipers. IOM, again, very active in repatriating different groups of people caught up in various fighting, so very active in 1990s, repatriating people from Kuwait, particularly Egyptians who were stuck there, and others to Asia. So we come into our current era, which is very much a fortress mentality. It's also a period where there's, again, the notion of whether it's refuge or it's economic migration. This whole asylum migration nexus becomes a big issue, managing migration, the challenge of protection, and also this tremendous rise of antipathy for forced migrants, even when they're fleeing armed conflict that's targeting civilians. It's a period when nationalists, the populist discourse is about keeping them out, them being the stranger, the other, the person fleeing, looking for safety, and also a period of great distortion of the contributions that refugees and migrants make to developed economies, and this return to the discourse of security. So the victims of armed conflict then often now being viewed as security risks. So we have our border patrols, we have our open sea operations, not so much to save people, but to push them back. A lot of bilateral treaties then emerge to keep migrants and asylum seekers contained along the eastern and southern Mediterranean, and IOM, again, assisting in the return of large numbers. I don't need to say much about here, except just to point out how quickly the numbers have risen. You know, in 1975, UNHCR was really only dealing with about 2.5 million people that were of concern, some of them refugees, some of them displaced people, some of them actually returnees, etc. And now we're talking about 72 million, a huge number, of which only about 28 million are recognized as refugees. And I'm adding the Palestinian figure into this. I think the UNHCR generally has a figure of about 22 or 23 million, but I thought it was worth adding the Palestinian figures, because what I want to do is just look at the Mediterranean region itself, which is where this particular project is focused, and rightly so. The burden is really on the Mediterranean. According to UNHCR, sometimes you get very, very different figures. Sometimes you get 26% of all the world's refugees are on the Mediterranean. When you add Palestinians and you look at their more recent figures, sometimes it's closer to half of the world's refugees are sitting on the eastern and southern rim of the Mediterranean. The numbers are so great that eventually we're now beginning to see the UN take some kind of action. In September of 2016, the United Nations General Assembly unanimously voted the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants. It was a landmark political declaration that was directed at improving the way that the international community responded to large movements of refugees and migrants, but also to protracted refugee situations. That particular declaration then set out what we now know has become part of the global compact on refugees, and also the other one, the Global Compact on Migrants, that was agreed in December 2018, with only 2 countries voting against it. And you all know, the United States and Hungary. That's just to say a little bit about this very aspirational document. Within it, you have what they call the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, which sets out specific actions to ease pressure on host communities, host countries, to enhance refugee self-reliance, to expand access to third country solutions somewhere down on that list, and to support conditions in countries of origin for return in safety and dignity. And along with that, a program of action, and also a set of large numbers of possible meetings to discuss how to go about doing that. The reason that I now want to turn to look at history of this is a lot of the aspirations in that document actually existed before. And that's really the point I want to get to, and we can perhaps think about whether or not some of these couldn't be raised again. So where did all this migration around the rim come from? Well, this region has been experiencing a quite massive forced migration. I would certainly say from the middle of the 19th century, when the European projects to create homogeneous nation states came up against both the colonial and imperial nature of the empires. So with the Ottoman Empire, just let me briefly say, I mentioned earlier that within the Ottoman Empire, your ethnicity wasn't necessarily tied to territory. And a lot of this has to do with the organization of the empire, whereby your ethnicity wasn't really important. It was your religious tie, whether you were Muslim, whether you were Christian, whether you were Jewish. It gave you belonging to a particular socio-religious organization and hierarchy that was dispersed throughout the empire. So your belonging had a kind of horizontal focus rather than a vertical one. And in that way, you could have ethnicities spread throughout the empire, but it also meant that mobility was very easy. So there was circular movement, there was movement throughout, and that was very common. Obviously, this system faced incredible pressure as the nation-state building was taking place, and if this pointer works, doesn't matter. You can see that through a great deal of meddling from Imperial Russia and also some support in Europe. First, Greece in 1832 became independent and a client of Russia and Britain, and then Bulgaria, Serbia, Montenegro, and so on. With each of these creations, there was a massive flight, mainly of Muslims, but also of Jews from the Pale of Settlement and from these areas. And of course, we are very familiar with the Armenian Holocaust, with the death marches from Eastern Anatolia into Syria between 1915 and 1916. The numbers are contested, but you can, I think, clearly say that somewhere between 750,000 to 1 million survived and ended up settling broadly in the area. In the 1920s, you had Albanians and Kosovars fleeing the new Soviet state. In the 1930s, you had hundreds of thousands of Assyrians and other Iraqis fleeing into Syria and Palestine. In the 1940s, of course, 750,000 of Palestinians fleeing at the time of the creation of the state of Israel. And then in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, you've got the Lebanese Civil War, the first Gulf War. Here, 500,000 in one, and then 1.5 million in the other. Certainly, by 2006, you had 1 to 2 million Iraqis streaming out of Iraq, and now you have massive numbers streaming out of Syria. 5-6 million, depending on which figures you want to follow. Well, the world hasn't responded in a very efficient way, and now let me just turn to some of the history of these movements. I want to go back to the first, whether you think a few thousand or even a few 100,000 is a lot, the kind of forced migrations that started from around the beginning of the 19th century and then moved on. I thought it was worth just looking at the European, I guess I could say, invasion of Egypt, just the beginning of the 19th century, which was responded to by the Ottomans sending an Albanian military officer, Muhammad Ali, to Egypt to reoccupy it. And I guess things went to his head a little bit. 10 years later, he decided he would take over the Hijaz. He moved into Syria, and he actually moved into Anatolia, so much so that he alarmed Europe, and that was the 1840 Oriental Crisis, in which Great Britain, Austria, Russia, and France insisted that he had to go back to Egypt. And they offered him, if you go back to Egypt, we'll create a hereditary Khedivate in Egypt. He did, but it also meant a lot of people being moved one way or the other, either trying to escape living in areas that he had tried to take over or not. Very soon thereafter, Abdel Qadir al-Jazairi, the Algerian religious and military leader who led the struggle against French colonialism between 1808 and around 1830s, finally was defeated, exiled in France, and eventually Napoleon III offered him the viceroyhood of Syria, which he rejected, but he chose to come to Syria, and with him came 5,000 Algerians. So these numbers were very clearly quickly absorbed. We don't hear much about them. There were a few 100,000, but it's when the numbers are, coming to 500,000 to 1 million, you have to ask yourself then, how did the Ottoman Empire respond to this? And that's what I just want to spend just a little bit more time. The Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 was probably the only one of the 6 wars that the Ottomans fought against the Russians in which they technically won. The British and the French sided with the Ottomans, and in the final treaty, which they had won, as with a lot of the treaties in those days, at the end of a war, there's a kind of pulling back to the position you held before the fighting started. And so in this case, although the Ottomans actually won, the Russians were able to say to the Ottomans and to the French and the British, okay, that's fine, but we don't want any Muslims in the Crimea. So all the Tatars of the Crimea were told they had to leave. They actually had about 2 or 3 months to sell their properties. They didn't quite leave without any possessions, but still, they were pushed out. That was about 500,000, and with them came another 500,000 Cossacks, Georgians and Ukrainians, who also wanted to get on the other side of the border from Russia. Very soon, that was the 1850s. In the 1860s, there was a huge Russian activity in the area of the Caucasus. The Russians defeated the Chechnyan religious political leader, Sheikh Shamil, and with his defeat, another 500,000 to 1 million. The numbers are imprecise, but I think it is in the millions, certainly according to Justin McCarthy, it is. They some will say they weren't pushed out, they left voluntarily, but basically they didn't want to live under the Orthodox Russian regime. And the Ottomans and the Russians actually hired some steamships, some on these Circassian forced migrants, because it's these people, these 3 to 4 million over less than 2 decades, who forced the Ottomans to think about how do we manage large numbers of forced migrants. And also, you know, another issue, the Circassians were, I guess Edward Said would say we really orientalized them, but they were really a people who fascinated Europeans. You know, the whole nomenclature of race in those days was based on the hypothetical beauty of the Circassian women, which is why white people were called Caucasian, and the military prowess of the men was also something that was written about. Voltaire wrote about them, many wrote about them. So there was a real interest in them. But for the Ottomans, they had to consider, how are we going to manage these large numbers? How do we, the question wasn't, how do we stop these people from coming? It was, how do we integrate and settle them or resettle them in the most beneficial places for the empire? So of course, a state always acts instrumentally, but the point is that it wasn't about let's hold them back, it's let's find a way of dealing with these numbers quickly. Let's get ourselves out of the emergency phase as quickly as possible. Let's disperse them out to provincial cities, to areas obviously that are underpopulated, and let's find a ways of integrating them and having them become subjects of the state as quickly as possible in this multicultural empire. So they were, these people were relocated largely in agricultural areas where tax farming needed to be reinvigorated, but also because of this notion of their military prowess, they were resettled in areas where there were ongoing and endemic local conflicts. So often the Circassians were put between feuding Bedouin and Kurds, Druze and Bedouin, and so on. But it's the response, obviously, of the Ottomans changed over time as the social and political economy of the empire changed, and as land pressure changed. At a certain point, by the end of the 19th century, they were actually being moved into areas where there was known to be malaria, and the Circassians were then used instrumentally to try and drain these areas. But the important thing was they established a legal framework. So in 1857, when they realized they had huge numbers of Tatar Muslims coming into their European empire, they established the Refugee Code or the Immigration Code. The Ottoman Turkish, sometimes it's translated as refugee, sometimes as migrant. I don't think the Ottomans actually distinguished between whether the person was a refugee or a migrant. If they were in need, then they could apply to have state land, and they could be exempted from taxes for a period of time. They could also be exempted from conscription for a period of time, anything in order to help them integrate and resettle. They were also given or promised the freedom of religion, whatever their faith. And in this case, I would say if their faith was one of the Ahl al-Kitab, Christian or Jewish, and they were permitted to construct their own places of worship. The only proviso that was that they couldn't sell the land that they were given for the first 20 years, and whether that was to prevent them from moving on or selling to speculators, it's not clear. But this applied also to people who came from Hungary, from Bohemia, from Poland, from Italy, Switzerland, even from the US, because during this period, the Ottomans actually advertised that they would accept migrants, and these are the kinds of things that they would provide the migrants for. So it was an emerging, I'm going to say in our terms today, looking back at it, as a liberal and very and rather tolerant policy towards the migrant, the forced migrant. They also endeared themselves to Britain and France, what was called the Comity of Nations, by their response to the Hungarian and Polish revolutionaries who were defeated in Transylvania in the 1848-1849 Hungarian uprising. Only about 10,000 to 16,000 people. The Austro-Hungarians insisted that they should be returned, and the Ottomans said, no, they've taken refuge rather exalted language, and we've guaranteed them refuge, but what we'll do is we'll move them away from the border. And this was a response which the British and the French were very happy with. They were always at odds with the Austro-Hungarians, but this was the notion of the duty to provide sanctuary. Let me just show you very quickly. I don't know if you can make out the little circles. I mentioned the kind of more instrumentalized approach to the settlement of the Circassians and the Chechens and the Dagestani, mainly along the border between agriculture and pastoral grazing lands, but areas where the Ottomans had trouble managing local conflicts. At that time, the Salain, which is mainly Kurdish today, was actually a Chechen settlement. It was a malarial area, and the Chechens never really managed to increase the size of their settlement to any great extent. So the code becomes a commission, and then the commission then starts to liaise with the Red Cross and the numerous missionaries in the region. But even though over time their policy changes, they're repopulating underpopulated areas, they're using the Circassians to defend frontiers, and as I said, they're environmentally using them to drain swamps and to turn malarial areas into productive farming zones. But it really was the first instance of direct, prolonged, and rational state social planning in the Muslim world, and probably the first of its kind in the world, to regulate immigration and devise a settlement policy that allowed people to become self-sufficient and independent as quickly as possible. There again is a second wave in the 1870s, 1890s, with another 1 to 2 million, I've mentioned that before. And there was meant to be, during this case, an exchange of populations. So there were Greek Orthodox Ottomans who were meant to go to the north of the Black Sea. Some Chechens at this point were unhappy with the local provisions that they were receiving because of the way that the Ottomans decentralized the kind of assistance which communities had. So some Chechens actually then returned during this era. And by the 1880s, now you had what was called the General Administration for Refugees Affairs. So this was, at this point, really very active engagement of locating land for resettlement, actually transporting the immigrants and the refugees to these lands, in some cases actually providing them with winter heating supplies, monthly income until they could have their first harvest, and insisting that it was local populations that had to engage with these resettlers. So in one document I saw that in Damascus, every head of household in Damascus was charged 1 piastre to assist refugees and immigrants to settle in the local areas. And this was particularly in Lahuta, which was the grazing land for the Sultan's many horses that were kept in the area. And that would have been the equivalent, the best I can come up with, is about $10 a year in order to try and assist these communities. So host communities, refugees, very, very integrated in this effort to become self-sufficient and start a new life. So, so let me now move with the new Turkish Republic. For many reasons, Ataturk pushed to modernize and felt that, certainly in the early years, anything that was based on Ottoman principles he would not be interested in. So he rejected many of these imperial institutions, but there was nothing to replace them. And so we then have to turn to what did the League of Nations do, what did Freehold Nansen do in terms of dealing with the stateless crisis basically in Europe. So we come sort of full circle. The Nansen era then, you could say, having learned the lessons before, making sure that the need to become self-sufficient wasn't separated from the political status of the individual. And so that Nansen passport, I would say, was the last of the recognition of the need for refugees to to be able to move, to find ways of integrating, that when you keep people stuck in one place for long periods of time, you deprive them of their agency, and also you deprive them of their ability to become independent and to stand really on their own legs. So I've gone full circle in order to really to come to this point. What can we actually learn from these imperial actions? Well, I hope that a lot of what I was talking about in terms of the Ottoman period at least rung a bell with the aspirations of the Global Compact of Migration. I'm sure many of you have read that compact. And you could see that during the Ottoman time, the state saw the necessity of moving from the emergency phase to the resettlement phase, which in today's terms is moving from, what do we call it, asylum to development is the kind of terminology we use. They also saw that you had to help these new immigrants or refugees, that they were potential citizens, that if they could get the farming going again, they'd be paying taxes and they'd be contributing to the state. So they saw this idea of let's revive the areas of the country that are underutilized and let's help these people become self-sufficient. They were also, the state saw that with technological advances, there were areas of their empire that had been off limits to settlement, that they could use these people instrumentally to help drain swamps, create new settlements, and help these people to thrive. But what they also did, and it depends on how it's managed, is they were also determined to prevent the formation of colonies or ghettos. So they encouraged the dispersal of people, and in that way you could say they actually helped to create a kind of local conviviality with many different others living close to themselves. Maybe that also explains why in the Middle East there was a general rejection of the 51 Convention and its protocol, preferring to look at the duty to provide protection. Also the recognition that within the Levant, with the Palestinian crisis, all of the states in that region did not want to see refugees be settled in third countries. They wanted them to be able to return home. But also you see now in the same region, amongst many refugees and forced migrants, and it'll be interesting to see if that's the findings that you're getting from the micro level of your studies here, they prefer to be classified as temporary guests or as workers rather than official refugees, much more interested in self-sufficiency, even if it meant working in the informal markets. And I think we should keep in mind how very large the informal markets are in this part of the world, and the obligation that many refugees have felt that they don't want charity, they want the opportunity to work, and in that way to be able to give something back. So I would say that these are all features which we in the 21st century would do well to reconsider. That fortress mentality is perhaps one that's not going to take us very far, and also this unwillingness, particularly amongst populist governments, to recognize the potential economic and political benefits of both refugees and migrants is something that perhaps we all need to challenge. So I'll stop here, and hopefully we'll have time for discussion.
From the resettlement phase, about how the Ottoman Empire were helping or resettling migrants and newcomers to their area, and then you move from the Ottoman presidents to the Ottoman rupture in 1923. But in between there, you have the 1915 Armenian Genocide. And I was just curious as to how you understand and situate the Armenian Genocide, a huge event where about 700,000 to 1.5 million Armenians were killed, into that history of settlement of Ottoman citizens.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You want to straight answer? Yeah? Okay.
That's a very good question to ask, and I'm not excusing anything related to the genocide, but there were massacres before, and of course the history is very complicated. The area that the Armenians inhabited and considered Armenia had a very big overlap also with the area of Kurdish settlement, in both cases indigenous. But starting from the 1860s, Muslims being displaced from the Caucasus were not only going to the Balkans, but they were coming into the same area where Armenians and Kurds were. So you had large numbers of Circassians, Chechens, Dagestani also coming into these areas. And these ethnicities were not always very comfortable with each other. So going back to the 1890s, you have one of the bigger massacres which takes place in this region. And then we lead up to World War I. The Ottomans, as I understand, and reading Eugene Rogan's latest work on the military campaigns of World War I, were very clearly regarded as a fifth column by the Ottomans. Now, whether there were written documents saying that this area had to be cleared or not doesn't mask the fact that militarily the Ottomans felt they had to clear this area. They cleared the area without making any conditions for how these people were going to survive in the death marches. And many who served in the Ottoman forces looked at Armenians as not only fifth column, but actively siding with the Russians. There were, by that stage, Armenian nationalism had become quite active, and many of the Armenian militias were fighting with the Russians at the same time. So in World War I, the Ottomans weren't looking at how are we going to resettle incoming populations. They were trying to get rid of that population from Anatolia. I mean, once they got out of Anatolia and started to approach the areas of Aleppo and moved out, they kind of weren't paying attention to that. They were much more involved in their military campaigns. So that's the beginning, I would say, of really the Armenian resettlement became an international effort, very much led by American missionaries, with resettlement being the main focus. But yes, it doesn't fit into this narrative, because you could say this narrative ends with the end of the 19th century. Well, it goes on a little bit longer, because you end up with, still in the early 20th century, with Albanians and Kosovars fleeing conflict that were taking place in the different Balkan wars as well.
Thank you. Alexander, and then, yeah. Okay.
Alexander Nagel from Göttingen University in Germany. Thanks a lot. I found this post-imperial lens very enriching for what we're doing here. In the latter part of your talk, you mentioned, or you characterized the Ottoman regime towards mass immigration as tolerant and liberal, while at the same time it sought to prevent segregation and ghettoization. Could you say a word more or two on this latter part? How did it prevent or seek to prevent ghettoization or segregation? Because to my knowledge, systems such as the millet system could be characterized as, you could say, multiculturalist, but also segregationalist regimes of conviviality in a way on which this empire basically was built. So I'd be interested to learn a bit more on this.
Thank you.
Well, if I turn to the Circassian Chechnyan communities, because the Chechnyan, the Circassian are a very hierarchical, tribal-based society, the Ottomans wanted to make sure they couldn't regroup, because the regrouping was always a threat to that kind of multiculturalism. So the elite of these communities were either allowed or forced to settle in Constantinople and various cities, but the rest were dispersed. They were encouraged to disperse. The land that, after the Ottoman Land Act, they were being granted land that basically spread them out throughout the empire. There was a very significant Jewish settlement that was being requested at that time, and again with the Jewish settlement, the Ottomans would only grant visas or settlement to families. So all the efforts to actually bring large groups and put them in one place, the Ottomans were rejecting. So in some ways you could say the same kind of policy was being set. I mean, you could say, I'm using the term liberal and tolerant, relatively speaking. Maybe you wouldn't say that in the 21st century, but in the 19th century, I think they were quite willing to disperse people as long as they fit into the millet system. But of course, the millet system didn't require you to be in any particular place. And the way in which land was dispersed was, I just want to find the right word. I don't know how premeditated it was, but certainly because of the way that they governed from the city, different cities would make requests for certain numbers to be able to come. So it functioned in that way of allowing a much more open approach to settlement rather than working to compartmentalize and keep people in particular areas. They were very fearful. They'd already had problems with some of the German Jewish settlements in Palestine by the 1880s, 1890s, and they didn't want to experience that again. So you could say they were also looking at the experience they had, and they were also very fearful of the massive influence that the missionaries, particularly the American missionaries, had in the region. So they were, again, trying to work against, let's not let too many people be in one area.
Thank you. Colleague from here. Yeah.
Name is Roberta Bello, English from Migrant Research in Bolzano, Italy. And my question is linked to what you said at the very beginning, referring to your colleagues from the UN, the International Civil Servant. My question is precisely the UN. You referred in your presentation to the UN as providers of data on refugees or displaced person, or as initiator of these global compacts that you defined precisely aspirational documents. So the role of this international organization is really marginal somehow, very limited in your presentation and in the reality of migration, global migration. So my question is whether you think that this multilateralism era through international organizations as the UN is really over, or never started probably, or do you see a hope through this mechanism? I'm referring to something feasible, like institutional building process that, for example, in Libya would have been so crucial to avoid the crisis that we are now facing, or also through humanitarian corridors that now is basically left to NGOs and other small organizations, and so not to touch conflict prevention or more ambitious objectives as conflict resolution.
That's a very interesting question, and I don't want to sound too critical. I had to pause for a minute because I was just thinking about the founder of the Refugee Studies Center, Barbara Harold Bond, was very unwelcome at UNHCR because she was always criticizing UNHCR. And I find myself kind of doing the same, but maybe a little bit more moderated. You know, the Global Compact on refugees is a very reactive document. It's reacting to what's already happening or happened on the ground that people, I think, generally see worked well. And what I'm referring to is the way that the UN system had to scramble in order to figure out how to deal with the outflow of Iraqis. Not in 2003, because all the camps they set up weren't even used. The Iraqis didn't flee as everybody said they would, nor did they greet the Anglo-American invasion. But when they did flee in huge numbers, as the country really disintegrated into sectarian violence in 2006, 2007, they refused to enter into the camps that were being set up by UNHCR. They went to the cities, they went to the neighborhoods, and it was the neighborhoods, and then eventually local NGOs that hosted them, that worked together. And this is why I say it's a reactive document, because you can see that that's also what happened originally with the Syrian crisis. So, Lebanon, for many reasons, didn't want any camps. The first few years, they were received well, hoping that they'd be able to go back quite soon. Same with Jordan. And, the Turkish response was really extraordinary when you consider those first few years. The numbers in camps were very slow, 10%, 15%, but mainly it was self-settlement, and it was the host community also receiving assistance along with the displaced Syrians and Iraqis. And this is where I think the UN system thought, gosh, we need to move in that direction. So there you have then Jeff Crisp doing his wonderful study in 2009, where instead of looking at urban settlement as somehow irregular, almost illegal, recognizing that we need to look at urban refugees. And I see this document is actually recognizing what's happening on the ground. And I say it's aspirational because it's also asking for greater contribution so as to make what civil society is trying to implement actually efficient and more workable. I mean, it's been rolled out in a few countries in Africa, but I think it's still early days to see how well it'll work. But maybe that's just how the system works, that it, you know, you react rather than think progressively. But I guess my message is, well, let's look to what we've done in the past and see if we can't make that a lesson for the future. When I was originally asked by Cambridge University Press to write a book about forced migration in the Middle East, my initial thought was, I don't know whether I can do that without being burnt out. I've got to find another way. And that's when I began looking at what I called the local cosmopolitanism of the region. How did that happen? And what I set about then interviewing the oldest surviving generation I could find for the big groups that had come in to what was formerly the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire. So I'm going to start backwards. So I interviewed many people who remembered their parents' or grandparents' reflections on the Chechnyan and the Circassian and the Albanian, some of the Kosovar, who came in at the very end of the 19th century or 20th century. And their stories reflected, difficult sentiments. There were some who really were frightened of them. They felt that they were very fierce, they were very warlike, but they stood up to the Bedouin. They refused to pay tribute to the Bedouin, and so when the local community began seeing, they're fighting off these people who've oppressed us locally, because the Ottoman didn't bother sending that many, gendarmerie out to stop the Bedouin from their incursions. In the areas of the Jolan, in the areas around Amman, there was this very slow sense of increasing respect for these outsiders, newcomers, who were not allowing themselves to be bullied by local thugs, so to speak. So there was a kind of transformation, so that you get to the point where when I began interviewing these generations in Syria and in Lebanon, the Syrians who could say that they'd been there for 300 or 400 years rather than just 100 years would always say, this is an amazing community. There was a great deal of respect for that community, which obviously is not the way it was when they first arrived, because they were regarded as brigands, as thieves, as people who sold their children, because slavery was very common amongst, or serfdom was very common amongst Caucasians at that time. So this is a good example of the community who on first arrival was regarded with a great deal of fear and suspicion, and then eventually kind of earned their place. So yes, I think a lot of our studies don't look at the perceptions of the host communities, and that is really what we need to look at. And I guess you could say in that way, and that will take me to the first question, the aspirations of the Global Compact on Refugees is significant, because it really does look at the host community, and it does suggest that whatever we do for the refugee, we should be doing for the host community. And in that way, it's aspirational, but it's built on what UNHCR has seen has been happening in Syria, Iraq, in the Levant over the last 10, 14 years or so. The problem with that, with the Global Compact, is that it doesn't change the status quo. It doesn't actually provide any legal protection. Legal protection is just not discussed in that document, and which means that refoulement, which we see happening in Lebanon, and it's also been happening in Turkey and in Jordan. They can say they haven't signed the 51 Convention, although Turkey has with reservation. I think that's a big problem in terms of the Global Compact, that it doesn't provide any legal protection. It's really supporting the status quo as things are, and it still depends on voluntary contributions, of which I think one of the figures that I saw was in some places the pledges have reached 60%, but I think in Jordan some of the pledges have only reached 10% of what they're expecting in order to be able to operate. I think your question regarding the Habsburgs and the Ottomans is very important, and yes, it is realpolitik, and the Ottomans were very good at that. They got a lot of brownie points from the Europeans by refusing to be bullied by the Habsburg. And You're right. I think also what's happening now is very much the same, because I was just saying this morning, what's playing out now is what I always thought was going to happen, but not perhaps with so much violence. I always thought that this was a card that was going to be used in order to bring the Assad government, or to bring the YPG back into the government orbit. But it's, I think you'll have to do your political science assessments. Yes, I mean, I try to be careful that I'm not doing too much of a revision of the Ottoman Empire, but I think it hasn't been credited for a lot of very interesting work and activity, particularly in the 19th century, which is always regarded as a time when it was falling apart, like the Armenian Europe, etc., etc. I think the empire at that time tried very hard to modernize in terms of what the West would recognize as modernization, but I think its policies with regard to these mass influx was way beyond what anything else was being done anywhere else. Forced migrants, how to define them? That's always the problem, as I tried to say with some of the later groups. I use the 1880s as an example. The groups coming later on from the Caucasus, the Abkhazi, some of the later migrants who had kind of sat there for 20 years, that's a whole generation, living under Orthodox Russian rule, decided they didn't want to anymore. They didn't want to live under Russian rule. They didn't want to have their sons have to serve in the Imperial Russian army, so they left. Well, are they voluntary migrants? Are they not forced migrants because they didn't leave at the first instance when they could have? I don't know. We always say anyway that forced migration, voluntary migration, it's like a continuum, and it's also what, it depends on what measures you want to use. Maybe in every forced migration there is some sort of voluntarism. People can choose to stay, people can choose to go, people can change their mind, there is that agency. So that's a big issue. I mean, even, I'm just thinking, this is the first week of term in Oxford in our master's degree, and the first question they get is, can you distinguish between forced and voluntary migration? So I don't have an answer for that. But the other issue that I see here, two things I'll say really quickly. Human mobility as a right. Well, human mobility as a right is what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights set out. And I think that was also a response to people not being able to leave Germany, for example, knowing that they were facing extermination, and not being able to cross the border, nobody giving people a visa. I mean, a lot of people, if they didn't have the right network, couldn't get out. And I think, all of our documents, legal or aspirational, are generally as a response to, it's reactionary. This is what happened in the past, so let's make sure that we make the ability to move as a right. And within that, I think, again, the 1951 Convention, is it out of date? I would say that it's not. It just needs to be cleaned up, or we need to get rid of some of the newer legislation. I mean, the Dublin Accords. I mean, whoever said that, you've got to, in the 51 Convention, it doesn't say that you've got to ask asylum in the first country that you reach. If your family is in a country that you have to cross 3 or 4 countries to get there, why can't you be reunited with your country? Why do you have to register? Well, that's not part of the 51 Convention. This is all part of all the different kind of rules that have been set into place. And I don't know the history of how Dublin 1, 2, and 3 came about, but it's certainly, I think, contrary to some of the elements that were part of the agreements set about when the EU was created, because I need to go back and actually look them up, but I think that within the EU documentation, there is meant to be shared responsibility in cases of mass influx, and it didn't really happen. But so these are political issues that relate to the economies of different countries, the political structure of different countries, the kind of populism, xenophobia that develops when you have certain kind of political, economic difficulties that would be really hard to work through.
Okay.
I think anything I haven't dealt with, I'm happy to deal with when we have a coffee break or when we have lunch.
Well, thank you very much, Professor.